Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be looking at supplier forms. So this is part of the procurement planning activities where we've already decided on our make or buy decision, presumably in the form of buy. So we're going to procure our input from outside of the organization, and now we need to start evaluating exactly what kind of relationship, structural relationship we're going to have with the supplier or suppliers, so we can really get the correct type of supplier selection process, and also establish exactly what our statement of work is going to look like. So we're going to run through the two major parts of deciding on the supplier form. Firstly, whether we're going to use a single supplier or multiple suppliers, and then we're going to look at the different types of structural relationships, i.e. the different types of client supplier or client suppliers form that we can use. So we're going to start with just looking at that first decision. Are we going to use a single supplier or are we going to use multiple suppliers? Now, there are a couple of things which are really important to bear in mind here. The obvious one is that whether you decide to use a single or multiple suppliers, it does very much depend on your context. So is security of supply of paramount importance? Or are we looking for overall cost reduction? So it has to fit into your overall objectives for this procurement cycle. But as well as this, we have some organization-wide considerations that we have to keep in mind. The most important of which is to understand that the marketplace, so the market that the suppliers operate within, and the market that you're going to reach into as a procurer, is a two-way process. So obviously there are some things about the market of suppliers which are outside of the ability of the procurer to influence. If there are some, technical specialities involved, then there may be relatively few suppliers. If there's barriers to entry, that as well may constrain the number of suppliers available. However, in other areas, we have to recognize that the procurer can and does influence the marketplace. So by your decision to use a single supplier or to use multiple suppliers, that decision that you make is going to influence the market itself. By giving large contracts to a single supplier, you're increasing that supplier's foothold in the marketplace. You're potentially affecting the competitive rivalry between that supplier and its competitors. If you use multiple suppliers, again, you're affecting the competitive balance and the competitive rivalry. So we need to understand the impact that our supplier form has on the marketplace, and if possible, use it to advance the organization's interests. So not only do we have to remember the context of the actual item or the input that we're procuring, but also the organizational structural interest in how we influence the marketplace. So if we start then by looking at a single supplier, and looking at the structural advantages and disadvantages to really develop our understanding about both of those broader contextual issues as well as the organizational wide issues. And we see something that should be relatively straightforward. If you use a single supplier, you are concentrating your purchasing power. So you're able to potentially gain a stronger hand when it comes to negotiating prices because the amount you're purchasing is greater. That leads to usually higher supplier motivation. So if you go back to our discussion about supplier strategies or lenses, the greater the value of the business, the greater, generally speaking, the supplier motivation is to win and retain your business. And it does provide continuity as well. So all of your inputs will be, or hopefully if the supplier does their job properly, be of uniform quality and type. It allows the development of knowledge and information within that relationship, so it potentially allows for a long-term beneficial relationship with that supplier, stretching across multiple contracts and potentially multiple projects or operations. All of this really serves to develop how that supplier understands your needs and therefore fulfills your needs on a long-term basis. Those all really only really come with single supplier forms. It's difficult to concentrate purchasing power. You will inevitably have lower supply motivation, and there will be continuity issues from using multiple suppliers. But there are some significant disadvantages as well. The most obvious of which is complacency. Using a single supplier with a large value contract or a contract which stretches across a lengthy time period does mean that the issues that we highlighted in our supplier relationship section last week do come into play. So this means that there's going to be reduced motivation after the contract has been won. It may potentially lead to increased complacency because there is a pre-existing long-term relationship in place, and all of the issues that we considered when considering the structural difference in the interests of the procurer and the interest of the supplier are really in full view. As well as this, the other two disadvantages are fairly broad as well. So by going to a single supplier, we are concentrating our purchasing power and therefore potentially reducing costs, but we do massively increase the risk of supply interruption. This means that there has to be resiliency built into that relationship and the arrangements. Otherwise, if there are any issues with that single supplier, whether they're production issues, logistics issues, or even financial issues with the supplier or otherwise, you are going to have an interrupted supply of your input, which may delay your project, damage your operation, or cause other significant drawbacks. Multiple suppliers don't remove the risk of supply interruption, but they do significantly decrease that risk. It's unlikely that the same suppliers or different suppliers are going to have the same risk profile in terms of production, finance, logistics, warehousing, and so on. So you are massively reducing that risk if you have multiple suppliers. But also, in connection to what we were discussing about the marketplace, if we use a single supplier form, we are contributing to a reduction of competition if the value of the contract is particularly large. We're increasing the structural advantage of that supplier in the marketplace against their direct rivals and the competitive rivals. And we are increasing that supplier's foothold and long-term stability. Now, that may be of value to the organization if they plan on pursuing a long-term relationship. A supplier which has a dominant position in the marketplace generally is in a position to offer lower costs and in many cases greater quality, so that may actually be a structural benefit. But in other cases, a single supplier which monopolizes a particular marketplace, those advantages are reversed. So to give an example of this, if you consider a supplier which has, let's say, 5 direct rivals, so there's 6 suppliers in the particular local marketplace, and this one supplier, despite having 5 rivals, actually has the majority of business within that marketplace. So they are clearly in a dominant position. They may have 60% of all of the value of contracts placed within the marketplace. However, they still have significant competition. 40% of the business is still won by by competitive rivals, and those rivals do pose a competitive threat if the dominant supplier was to fail to maintain their cost or quality advantages. In this case, the concentration of purchasing power, i.e., the ability to have lower total cost, would not really be have a drawback against the potential lack of competition. there is significant competitor rivalry within the marketplace. If we contrast this with another situation where a single supplier has over 90% of the business within a particular marketplace, and only has, say, one or two real rivals within that marketplace, now the lack of competition actually does potentially significantly threaten the procurer organization structural interests. The lower cost that comes from going to a dominant supplier would often be reversed in a monopoly situation, because the single supplier that has a dominant position has a monopoly or a potential monopoly. Means that there's far less incentive to compete on cost and quality, and instead the built-in advantages of a monopoly, higher barriers to entry, and other advantages which the dominant supplier has can be leveraged into actually providing higher margins for the suppliers, and therefore higher cost for the procurers. So in that scenario where you only have a handful of competitors and you have over 90%, let's say, of the business within a particular marketplace, a monopoly situation or a duopoly, depending on the configuration of the marketplace, if you only have a couple of dominant suppliers, that is actually quite a dangerous situation for a procurer. It means that they are dependent on a few dominant suppliers. There isn't any real competition. And therefore the monopoly costs that are imposed, generally in the form of higher margins and or lower quality, will produce a worse procurement outcome. In this case, what we'd want to do is really consider not just a single supplier, but whether it would be beneficial for the organization to consider a situation where multiple suppliers are involved in satisfying the procurement need. So here the major advantage really is the encouragement of competitive forces within the marketplace, as well as achieving security of supply. So if you have a situation where there is a potential monopoly emerging within the marketplace of suppliers, you can discourage this monopoly and provide financial support to competitors of the dominant supplier or suppliers, and therefore act to try and reduce the possibility of a monopoly emerging. That would be one major motivation for going for a system of multiple suppliers instead. The other major motivation would be a situation where the procurement need which is being fulfilled is some kind of critical need, where any delays, quality compromises, or issues with logistics is going to severely impact the project or the operation. And we need a secure, uninterrupted supply of the input coming into the organization. Here, multiple suppliers reduces that risk of supply interruption significantly for the reasons that we've discussed. So those would be the two major reasons we would want to consider multiple suppliers, but there are disadvantages that come with this as well. So reduced purchasing power, because our individual contracts are going to be for smaller values because they're split across multiple suppliers. That typically means higher costs. There won't be the same advantages that we can leverage in terms of our negotiating position as a procurer, and therefore the cost will typically be significantly higher depending on the other circumstances. Supplier motivation does tend to be lower as well, although this does depend on the specifics. But if the value of the contract is lower than it could be, and the supplier is aware that there are multiple other suppliers engaged in the same procurement cycle, then that may not be a priority for them, and therefore lowers their motivation to actually achieve the highest possible performance within the execution of the contract. As well as this, you do have additional coordination and administration costs when it comes to multiple suppliers. Those suppliers have to be coordinated. Logistics becomes more complex because we have multiple suppliers bringing inputs into the organization. Any shifting of supply between different suppliers in terms of the input, again, that imposes significant additional administration costs as well. So that will result in a situation where there has to be a compelling reason again, either the security of the supply or trying to encourage competitive forces within the marketplace to actually go for multiple suppliers. Otherwise, it will result in, generally speaking, higher costs due to reduced purchasing power, issues with supply motivation, and those coordination and administration costs. So, if we have considered those in our procurement planning and we've made a decision, we can move on to looking at the different types of client supplier forms. So this is the form of the relationship that we can actually use. So there are some for multiple suppliers or single suppliers. But if we first just consider the simplest, the most straightforward of client supplier forms, that of a single contract. You have a client, you have the procurer, and then you have the contractor or the supplier. So you're purchasing directly, whether it's goods, services, labor, and so on, directly with the supplier, and that supplier is providing all of the input that is actually required, and it has all of the advantages and disadvantages of a single supplier form. And that's relatively straightforward. However, when it comes to multiple suppliers, we have a couple of additional things to consider. So the first is a parallel contract. So this is where the client or the procurer is splitting the input across different suppliers, but they're each interacting directly with the procurer. So the onus on coordination and administration of dealing with multiple contractors is going to fall upon the client or the procurer themselves. If we consider here an example where, let's say, as a procurer, you're looking to renovate a particular room, so your project is to renovate a room or a facility, then in a parallel contract, you may have different contractors providing a variety of different inputs, or perhaps providing the same input but split across multiple suppliers. The onus for actually coordinating that work, making sure different packages are done at the appropriate times, all would fall upon the procurer or the client themselves. If we look at the next type of multiple contract supplier, we have something which looks relatively similar, but this is just some difference in terms of execution, which is a sequential contract or sequential contracts. So here you have multiple suppliers, but all of them are doing or supplying inputs which are significantly different, but also fit in within a larger framework or a larger project. Therefore, there is a degree of interaction or handover or deliverables between different contractors. So we used an example when it came to parallel contracts of renovating a room. One contractor needs to go in and let's say repaint the room, then another contractor needs to come in and do their work. So that would be a case where your contractors are essentially need to carry out their work in a particular sequence, but otherwise there's limited to no interaction between the contractors themselves. So the contracts can run in parallel, and the coordination can be done by the client. With a sequential contract, there will be some deliverables that need to move between contractors and a degree of interaction which is required, but it's still the client which ultimately is going to be overseeing, coordinating, and administrating the whole process themselves. So an example of this could be where there is a specific deliverable which needs to move from the first contractor to the second contractor. So to stick to my example of renovation, if you have a more complex renovation or the creation of a brand new room, so let's say taking an office space and making it into an auditorium or a presentation hall, then you may have one contractor responsible for the design documents to actually design the place itself, and then they need to hand over and coordinate, or at least interact with the second contractor, which may be actually carrying out the work involved. So not only do these have to run in a particular sequence, there is a degree of interaction, and deliverables that need to move from one contractor to another contractor, and it is the client or the procurer which ultimately is still going to be coordinating and overseeing the process as a whole. Now, what we can do to try and reduce the administrative and coordination burden on the procurer or the client is to move to another form or another form, which is prime contracting. So here, instead of directly overseeing and coordinating activities, the client contracts with a prime contractor, and it's their responsibility to actually deliver, let's say, the auditorium or the presentation hall as a whole, and then the prime contractor will then bring in subcontractors and coordinate and oversee their work. So the relationship that the procurer has is almost entirely with the prime contractor. Depending on the contractual terms and conditions, they may have a role in approving subcontractors, or they may leave it entirely up to the prime contractor and go on performance specification instead. But either way, this reduces the administrative and coordination burden on the client or the procurer, and instead moves it on to a prime contractor. We also have two additional forms of a single supplier forms. The first of which, in addition to the standard single contract, which would be a turnkey contract. So with a turnkey contract, it may look very similar to a single contract, but the difference here is in the nature of the relationship itself. With a single contract, you're looking for an input of some kind from a supplier. With a turnkey contract, the goal is actually to get a supplier to hand over a already running facility, process, or item. So think of things like, what's often used turnkey contracts are things like facilities designed for a particular purpose, like a power station. The contractor will assume all responsibilities with significant freedom to actually get the facility up and running. And then when the facility is handed over, it's ready for immediate operation. So you literally put the key in, you turn it, and everything starts. So it's a very specific type of contract. If you haven't used turnkey contracts in your project teams or your organizations, it's almost certainly down to the fact that it wouldn't be appropriate. It's a very particular type of contract used to really hand over facilities usually that need to be in operation as soon as they are handed over or delivered to the client themselves. The last form, which is the other form of a single supplier relationship, is partnering. So this is similar to a single contract, and again that you're dealing with a single supplier, but the relationship here is very much a two-way relationship where the supplier doesn't just contribute the input, but also contributes expertise, experience, and building towards a common goal. Where decision-making powers do not just rest with the client or the procurer, but decision-making powers are very much shared across both informal and informal ways between the two, creating a partner relationship as opposed to the traditional client-supplier relationship where decision-making powers rest solely with the client.